Hi, I'm Sherry from Whole Circle Studio, and it is week 4 of our Butterfly Bunch quilt along. Last week we got our butterflies assembled, and you can see some of my butterflies, or actually all 4 of my butterflies here. And this week I'm going to give you some tips of how I get them all together and also removing the paper. So first thing you'll want to do is lay out your butterflies how you want. Remember, your coloring sheet is a good handy tip for, handy reference, I should say, for that. And then the next thing you'll want to do is decide how you want to put them together. And what I mean by that is you certainly can, if I want to arrange these two like this, I can flip this over. And I have my line here that gives me my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Remember that line that we had, sort of the inner line and the outer line? We cut the paper on the outer line. If you want, and you don't want to fuss with seam allowances on your machine, you can certainly just pin these together. Again, I'd use my positioning pins like I used last week. If you hadn't seen that video, go back to week 3. I'd use positioning pins if there were critical alignments that I want to match up, and I can sew right along that line and then open it up and press it open and do the same thing for the others. But I find with this pattern, because it's nice and square, you don't need the paper to do that seam allowance. You could take the paper off. It will make it a little bit easier later on. And then just use however you get a 1/4 inch seam, whether it's using the foot of your presser foot or using a guide. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take off all my paper. But again, if you're not fond of that, you can certainly use the paper as a guide. So I'm going to take my paper off and then put the blocks together, and let me show you just some tips for that. I like to just start at the edges, and sometimes in the bigger areas it makes sense to do that first. I'm actually going to start on this edge because I wanted to show you some of these trickier pieces. I like to use just a regular old pair of tweezers, and I'll sometimes start, this one's already started, but just start at the edge, and you can kind of just push your tweezer edge along that, and that makes perforating that paper really easy. And then I'll also, for these little parts, I can use my fingernail, or I can just get in there and pick out the paper, and that little square is out, and just go all the way around doing that. And then once you perforate one edge, the other edge will come up pretty easily. If you're finding that your thread is coming out, perhaps you didn't backstitch at the edges, if it's coming out at the edges, the thread, your stitches, or even in the middle, some strategies maybe, I go pretty aggressively with my tweezers, but maybe just go a little bit less aggressive, or it may be the thread that you're using. I recommend using a high quality thread. I really like Aurifil 50 weight and the cotton, and perhaps the weight has to do something with it as well if you're using a thinner weight. Those are my big tips. This week, get together your butterflies, add a border if you wish, and I give some suggestions for that in the pattern. Next week, I am going to, between now and next week, make my quilt sandwich, and next week I'm going to show you some of my strategies for quilting it all together. I hope you're having a great time making your butterflies. Let's make something awesome.